The bounty board's holographic display flickered against the dim haze of ROK Station's cantina. Its list of wanted fugitives hovered above the heads of mercenaries and smugglers nursing their drinks. At the top of the list, pulsating in a menacing green hue, was a name that could silence a room: Zara Rule. The image of her face glared out from the projection, green skin, smooth and flawless despite its sharp, predatory angles. Her piercing black eyes seemed to stare back at anyone brave or foolish enough to look at the board. The reward was staggering: 10 million credits. Dead or alive. Below her image, the description was blunt and foreboding. Wanted for assassination, mass murder, theft of galactic intelligence. Extreme caution advised. At that moment, Zara didn't feel like a deadly assassin. She felt like prey. Her lungs burned as she sprinted through the back alleys of ROK Station. The air here reeked of rust and decay, a sharp contrast to the gleaming corporate facades of the upper levels. Shadows danced wildly around her as she darted past malfunctioning neon signs and piles of scrap. Her boots barely made a sound against the grates beneath her feet, but the distant, metallic ping of a bounty hunter's tracker was relentless. Zara pressed herself into the shadows, her back against a jagged wall. She clutched the hilt of the blade strapped to her thigh, its grip familiar and reassuring. Her breaths were controlled, shallow, though her pulse roared in her ears. She had survived worse. Far worse. Still, the stakes were higher now. These weren't the standard, desperate bounty hunters she had evaded for years. These were professionals, likely syndicate-funded, armed with military-grade tech. She'd seen them in action before. They didn't give up, and they didn't take prisoners. Her green skin, a mark of her people, the Thalari, shimmered faintly under the station's dim lighting. Once, her kind had been revered across the galaxy for their unmatched agility and endurance. But now, the Thalari were few and scattered, often exploited as hired killers. Zara had been one of the best. Maybe she still was. But after years of bloodshed and betrayal, even she wasn't invincible. Act 2, the hideous jacket. The tracker's ping grew louder, sharper, echoing in the narrow passage. Zara's muscles tensed, ready to spring. She had one rule: never stop moving. She darted around the next corner, her hand grazing the hilt of her blade. Her mind raced. The freighter docks were a few alleys down. If she could reach one, she might slip aboard a departing ship. Suddenly, she collided with something solid. The impact sent her staggering back a step. Her dagger was out before she even registered what, or who, she'd hit. The blade's edge gleamed under the faint neon lights as she leveled it directly at a man's throat. The man froze, his hands raised slowly. Whoa, okay. Let's not make this a stabbing situation. Zara's black eyes locked on him, narrowing in deep suspicion. He was human, tall but lanky, with a wiry frame that didn't suggest much physical strength. His shaggy brown hair stuck out at odd angles, and his clothes were a mismatched patchwork of worn fabric and stained leather. The leather jacket he wore was particularly hideous, an oversized monstrosity that had clearly seen better days. "Move," she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "Gladly," he said, not moving an inch. "But, you might want to take a second to." A shrill, rapid beep interrupted him. Zara's blood ran cold. The tracker was close. Too close. "Friends of yours?" the human asked, glancing past her shoulder down the alley. "Quiet," she snapped, her dagger still poised. She turned her head slightly, scanning the dim corridor for movement. The faint red glow of a targeting laser flickered against the wall to her left. "Listen," the man said, his voice remarkably calm for someone with a hyperalloy blade at his throat. "I don't know what kind of mess you're in, but unless you enjoy being vaporized, we should probably go. Now." Her gaze snapped back to him, her grip on the dagger unwavering. "Why would you help me?" He grinned, a lopsided, boyish smile that made him look absurdly out of place in a high-stakes death chase. "Call it a bad habit. Also, I really don't want to get shot just because I happen to be standing next to you." Another beep. Louder. The bounty hunters were closing in. Zara weighed her options in a split second. She didn't trust him. She didn't trust anyone. But staying here was suicide. "Fine," she said, lowering the blade just an inch. "But if this is a trap, I'll gut you." "Noted," he replied, remarkably unfazed. "Follow me." Act 3, the rust bucket. The man took off, moving with surprising speed and confidence through the labyrinthine alleys. Zara followed close behind, her eyes constantly scanning every shadow for signs of an ambush. He led her through a final, narrow passage that opened onto a dingy, low-tier docking bay. The air here was thicker, tinged with the acrid smell of burning fuel and overheated engines. In the center of the bay stood a freighter that could, generously, be described as functional. Its hull was a patchwork of mismatched panels, scorched and dented from what looked like years of hard, unforgiving use. The name Rust Bucket was crudely painted along the side in fading letters. "This is your ship?" Zara asked, her voice dripping with disdain. He shot her an offended look. "Hey, she's got character. And she flies, most of the time." Blaster fire erupted behind them, cutting off any further commentary. Bright blue plasma bolts melted the metal frames of the doorway they had just exited. "Inside now," he shouted, slamming his palm against the external control panel to lower the boarding ramp. Zara didn't hesitate, sprinting up the creaking ramp as bolts of plasma whizzed past her head. The man, Derek, she realized he'd called himself when yelling at the console, was right behind her. The heavy ramp slammed shut just as a plasma bolt scorched the external hull, sending a violent vibration through the deck plates. "Hold on," Derek said, leaping straight into the pilot's seat. His hands moved with practiced, chaotic ease over the controls, flipping switches and adjusting levers as the ship roared to life. The engine sputtered, coughed, and then surged with a deafening, rhythmic roar. The ship shuddered violently as it lifted off. Zara grabbed a nearby railing for balance, glaring at the back of Derek's head. "You call this flying?" "I call it improvising," he shot back, grinning like a madman as he maneuvered the rattling freighter out of the docking bay and into the atmosphere. Outside, the stars suddenly stretched into a blurred tapestry of white light as the ship jumped blindly into hyperspace. Zara exhaled slowly, her tense muscles finally relaxing. For now, she was safe. But as she looked over at Derek, who was still grinning like a fool while piloting a battered death trap, she couldn't shake the feeling that her troubles had only just begun. Act 4. Coffee and Contraband. The Rust Bucket groaned as it settled into the hyperspace corridor, lurching like a wounded animal. Zara braced herself against the ship's bulkhead, her sharp eyes scanning the cockpit. The console was an absolute mess. Cables hung loose, panels were held together with industrial tape, and a blinking light labeled engine temp glowed in an ominous, steady red. "Is this thing held together with glue?" she asked, her voice sharp with skepticism. Derek didn't glance back. Glue would have been an upgrade. He flipped a series of switches with practiced precision, his easy grin betraying absolutely no concern over the freighter's obvious state of disrepair. Zara studied him with cold intensity. He didn't look like much: messy hair, a worn-out jacket, and a carefree attitude that grated heavily against her survival instincts. Yet, there was something unnervingly deliberate about his movements. He wasn't the hapless fool he pretended to be. Only when the hyperspace hum stabilized did Derek swivel his chair to face her, his grin softening into something almost curious. "All right," he said, leaning back casually. "Now that we're not actively being shot at, mind telling me what's going on? Or do I have to guess?" Zara crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. "You don't need to know. See, that's where you're wrong." Derek gestured around the cramped cockpit. "You're on my ship now. If I'm risking my neck for you, I deserve answers." She considered him for a moment, weighing her options. Trust didn't come easily. She'd seen too many betrayals, survived too many ambushes. Yet, Derek wasn't acting like someone after the 10 million credit bounty. He hadn't tried to drug her, restrain her, or steer the ship toward a sector controlled by the authorities. "You know who I am," she said finally, her tone clipped. "Zara Enrule," he replied, his grin returning. "Galaxy's deadliest assassin. Wanted in 17 systems. Allegedly." She raised an eyebrow. "Allegedly?" He shrugged. "People exaggerate. Besides, you don't look as scary as the boards say." Zara took a slow step closer, her entire presence radiating quiet, lethal menace. "Do you want to test that theory, human?" Derek raised his hands, palms out. "Nope. I'm plenty convinced." Her glare lingered before she stepped back, returning to her place by the bulkhead. For a moment, only the heavy hum of the ship's engines filled the silence. "What's your angle?" she asked, breaking the quiet. "You helped me. No one in this galaxy does that without a reason." Derek tilted his head, as if the very question amused him. "Maybe I just don't like bounty hunters." She snorted. "Try again." "Fine," he said, his grin fading into something a bit more grounded. "Truth is, I've been on the run too. Not for anything big, just smuggling a little contraband here and there. But I know what it's like to be hunted. I figured you could use a break." Zara frowned, her suspicions still entirely intact. "You're awfully relaxed for someone who just outrun professional corporate killers." "Relaxed?" He laughed, leaning forward. "You think I'm not scared out of my mind? Of course I am. But what's the point of panicking? It doesn't help anyone." His answer genuinely surprised her. Most people faced with her reputation would be groveling, terrified, or actively plotting to sell her out. Derek, for all his strange, chaotic charm, was an enigma. "You're an idiot," she said bluntly. "Probably," he agreed, completely unfazed. Zara followed him into the ship's common area, which turned out to be little more than a cluttered dining space, crammed tightly between storage lockers. Worn-out seats surrounded a scratched metal table covered in scattered tools and half-eaten ration packs. Derek opened a rusted cabinet and retrieved 2 stained cups, filling them with something steaming from a battered dispenser. He slid one toward her. "What is this?" she asked, eyeing the dark, murky liquid suspiciously. "Coffee. Sort of. It's a work in progress." She sniffed the liquid, instantly grimacing. "It smells like engine coolant." "That's the charm," he said, taking a long sip without flinching. "Grows on you." Zara didn't touch her cup. Instead, her attention wandered to the cluttered room. Tools, spare parts, and scraps of open circuitry littered every available surface. The ship felt incredibly lived in, a stark contrast to the sterile, utilitarian, cold military craft she was used to. "You actually live like this?" she asked. "Hey, don't judge the rust bucket. She's been through a lot, just like her owner. And you've survived in this? I'm amazed it hasn't fallen apart in deep space." Derek grinned, looking remarkably proud. "She's tougher than she looks. Kind of like you." The comment caught her entirely off guard. It wasn't flirtatious, and it wasn't mocking. It was just matter of fact. Zara glanced at him, genuinely unsure how to respond to an unfiltered compliment. "I'll take that as a compliment," she said eventually, her voice lowering. "You should," he replied. Suddenly, the deep hum of the engine shifted. A subtle, sharp vibration shuddered through the deck plates, a change that Zara's trained instincts noticed immediately. She straightened up, her hand dropping back toward her thigh. "What was that?" Derek frowned, his light-hearted demeanor instantly vanishing. He moved quickly to a small diagnostic console on the wall, studying the scrolling text. "Looks like we've got a tail. Someone must have tagged us with a localized tracker." "How did you miss that?" she demanded, stepping up right beside him. "Hey, I'm a pilot, not a miracle worker," he shot back. "They must have tagged us during the chaotic launch back at the station. Don't worry, I'll shake them." Zara's eyes narrowed into a dangerous glare. "You had better, human." Derek dashed back into the cockpit, with Zara tracking his every move. The proximity alarm blared a rhythmic, high-pitched warning as the ship's primary scanners finally picked up the pursuing vessel. Derek's fingers flew over the console, stabilizing the trajectory display. The screen painted a grim picture. Their pursuer was a sleek, predatory craft finished in matte black paint. Its sharp silhouette cut a menacing frame against the swirling backdrop of hyperspace. "They're fast," Derek muttered, his knuckles tightening on the flight stick. "They're bounty hunters," Zara corrected, her voice cold. "They're always fast. Do you have any brilliant ideas?" She studied the incoming data stream, her strategic mind calculating vectors. "You said this ship is tough." "Exactly how tough?" Derek hesitated, looking at a flashing structural schematic. "Tough enough." "What?" "Because they expect us to run," Zara said, a dangerous glint appearing in her black eyes. "So we won't." Derek's eyes widened as he glanced up at her. "You want to fight a high-tier interceptor in this? Do you have a better plan?" I was leaning toward not dying. "But sure, let's try your way." Zara smirked, the predatory angles of her face sharpening. "Don't worry, human. I've done this before." Derek muttered something under his breath about severely regretting his life choices, but he pulled the manual override levers anyway, ripping the rust bucket violently out of hyperspace. The pursuing craft closed the distance instantly, its forward weapons systems already charging with brilliant red energy. Zara slid into the gunner's seat, anchoring her boots into the floor grates. She activated the ship's modest defenses, typing in a manual tracking sequence. "This arsenal is pathetic," she muttered. "Hey, she's a freighter, not a warship," Derek shouted defensively. The enemy ship opened fire. Bright plasma bolts streaked through the void, boiling the vacuum of space. Derek maneuvered the rust bucket with surprising, erratic skill, throwing the ship into sudden lateral drifts to dodge the worst of the incoming salvos. Zara took steady aim with the ship's light cannons, waiting for the precise moment the interceptor's shield cycle dipped. She fired. The first heavy thermal round connected, grazing the enemy ship's starboard wing and scattering blue sparks across its hull. "Not bad," Derek yelled over the roar of the engines, a genuine hint of admiration in his voice. "Shut up and fly," Zara snapped, tracking the target as it looped around for another pass. Derek grinned, throwing the freighter into a sudden, unannounced roll. The violent maneuver sent Zara stumbling against her restraints, but it forced the overeager enemy ship to overshoot its trajectory. Taking absolute advantage of the opening, Zara pulled the primary trigger again. This time, the plasma rounds hit dead center, slamming directly into the enemy's primary engine cluster. The pursuing craft faltered, its stabilization systems sparking wildly as it began to drift out of control. "Nice shot," Derek cheered, leveling the rust bucket and punching the secondary thrusters to accelerate away from the disabled vessel. Zara exhaled slowly, her white-knuckled grip on the gunner controls finally relaxing. "You're completely insane," she murmured, glancing over at him. "Maybe," Derek admitted, matching her look. He leaned back in his chair, his signature boyish grin slowly returning. "So, about that coffee." Zara rolled her eyes, but she couldn't completely suppress the faint smirk tugging at the corners of her lips. Against all conventional logic, she had to admit, this human wasn't entirely useless. Act 6, Breakfast Special. An hour later, the rust bucket floated quietly in an isolated sector of deep space, its engines humming an uneven, wheezing rhythm. Inside the common area, the ambient lighting was low, casting jagged shadows against the scratched metal walls. The air smelled heavily of scorched wiring, ozone, and a strange, earthy aroma Zara couldn't quite place. It wasn't entirely unpleasant, just unfamiliar. Zara sat stiffly at the metal table, her posture perfectly erect, her hand resting naturally near the hilt of the blade strapped to her thigh. Her black eyes tracked Derek as he rummaged through a rusted cabinet that looked like it was held together by sheer luck. "Do you even know what you're looking for?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Breakfast," Derek replied cheerfully. He pulled out a dented metal canister and gave it a firm shake, producing a dull, heavy rattle. "Well, what passes for breakfast around here?" Zara raised an eyebrow. "I don't trust anything that comes out of that cabinet." Derek glanced over his shoulder, a crooked grin on his face. "You trusted my flying. That worked out." "Barely," she shot back. He laughed, dumping the canister's contents into a battered pan. The thick concoction sizzled instantly, releasing a faintly synthetic, savory aroma. Zara's nose wrinkled, but she said nothing. She had eaten worse on survival missions, and certainly in far worse company. "Do you have a name for this sludge?" she asked. "The Breakfast Special," Derek declared with a dramatic flourish. "Guaranteed to taste almost like real food. Or close enough if you don't think too hard about it." "That is not reassuring." "Welcome to the rust bucket," he said, sliding into the seat across from her and setting down two mismatched metal plates. Each was piled high with a pale, rubbery substance that faintly resembled scrambled eggs. "Nothing's perfect, but everything works. Mostly." "Dig in." Zara stared down at the plate. "What is actually in this?" Derek shrugged, already digging into his own portion. "Nutrient paste, protein powder, a little local system seasoning. It's good for you." "That is not what I asked." "You'll survive," he said, grinning. Her eyes narrowed, but she picked up a fork and poked at the meal. It jiggled slightly. She took a cautious, clinical bite, chewing slowly. The texture was bizarre, and the flavor was practically non-existent. "This is awful," she said flatly. Derek smirked, shoveling another forkful into his mouth. "It's not supposed to be good, Zara. It's supposed to keep you alive. Big difference. She set her fork down, folding her arms over her chest. What is the point of surviving if you have to consume this? Perspective, he said, pointing his fork at her. After a meal like this, literally anything else in the galaxy will taste amazing. Even ration bars. Or engine grease, she muttered. Derek chuckled loudly, leaning back in his chair. You're funny. I didn't expect that from a legendary assassin. I am not trying to be funny. Even better, he smiled. Zara let the silence stretch between them, watching the human eat with an ease that bordered on unsettling. He was completely unlike anyone she had ever encountered. Most people, when faced with her identity, were either paralyzed by fear or calculating how to betray her. Derek seemed entirely unbothered by her presence. You've taken this remarkably well, she said quietly, breaking the silence. Taken what well? Me, she said simply. The fact that you have the galaxy's most wanted fugitive sitting at your dinner table. Most people would be terrified. Derek shrugged, his expression turning a bit more serious. I don't scare easily. Besides, you don't seem like you're going to kill me. Yet, she added, her tone completely unreadable. He grinned. See? That's what I like about you. Always keeping me on my toes. Before Zara could formulate a response, a sharp, piercing alarm blared through the common area, cutting through the low hum of the ship. Proximity alert. Zara was on her feet in an instant, her hand locking onto her dagger. What is it? Someone's tailing us again, Derek said, his relaxed demeanor instantly vanishing as he ran back toward the cockpit. Act 7, the asteroid field. The cockpit was a chaotic mess of flashing red indicators. Derek slid into the pilot's seat, his fingers flying across the secondary controls to stabilize the long-range scanners. The screen flickered to life, displaying a bulky, heavily armored ship closing fast from their rear flank. Its design was angular and aggressive, with massive twin-linked plasma cannons mounted on its sides. Pirates, Derek muttered, his face darkening. Of course. They must have picked up the lingering signal from that tracker before we fried it, Zara said, leaning over his shoulder to study the readouts. Looks like they're planning to cash in on that bounty of yours, Derek said, adjusting their trajectory. More likely they'll strip this ship for parts and leave us to suffocate in the void, she corrected. Always the optimist, Derek muttered. The pirate vessel fired its first salvo. A heavy barrage of plasma bolts erupted across the void, sizzling violently against the rust bucket's rear shields. The entire ship shuddered, throwing Zara off balance. Shields are dropping fast, down to 50%, Derek shouted, gripping the flight stick tightly. This is about to get bumpy. You think? Zara snapped, pulling herself into the gunner's seat once more. She slammed her hands onto the weapon controls, activating the primary targeting matrix. The rust bucket's light cannons roared to life, unleashing a rapid volley of plasma rounds. Most melted uselessly against the pirate ship's heavy armor, but one precise shot connected near their forward sensor array, leaving a deep scorch mark. Not bad, Derek yelled. Don't get cocky, she warned, resetting her aim. The pirate ship fired again. A perfectly aimed heavy bolt slammed directly into the rust bucket's rear thruster housing. Warning lights flared across the entire console, and the deep hum of the engine began to sputter and die. We're losing primary power, Derek shouted, his voice tight with genuine panic. Then stop running, Zara ordered. Excuse me. Bring us closer to them, she said, her voice dropping into a deadly calm. They won't expect a disabled freighter to charge them. Derek hesitated for a fraction of a second, looking at the failing power grids, then nodded grimly. You're the boss. He threw the flight stick forward. The rust bucket veered sharply, hurtling directly toward the massive pirate vessel. The suicidal maneuver completely caught the pursuers off guard, and their forward weapons fire faltered as they scrambled to adjust their trajectory. Zara seized the precise microsecond of confusion. She locked her targeting reticle onto the pirate ship's exposed main weapon coupling and fired a single, maximum charge plasma round. The shot hit dead center. A massive secondary explosion rippled across the pirate ship's forward hull, completely disabling its heavy cannons and sending the bulky vessel spinning out of control. Direct hit. Derek cheered, a note of pure awe in his voice as the smoking pirate ship veered away into the dark. Zara stood up, brushing a strand of hair out of her eyes as she walked past him. You call that fun? I call it surviving. Derek turned his chair to face her, a genuine smile replacing his panic. You're really good at this, you know. I've had practice, she replied coldly, walking back toward the common area. Derek watched her go, a soft smile tugging at his lips. He didn't say it aloud, but he was starting to realize that having the galaxy's most dangerous assassin on his ship might be the best thing that ever happened to him. Act 8. The Gravity Anomaly. The rust bucket limped through the quiet void, its primary engines wheezing heavily from the cumulative damage of the double ambush. The interior lights flickered intermittently, casting an eerie, rhythmic pulse through the hallways. Zara leaned against the bulkhead of the common area, her arms crossed as she watched Derek work beneath an exposed floor panel. Sparks jumped from the chaotic tangle of wires he wrestled with, temporarily illuminating his grease-streaked face. Remind me again, she said dryly, why I trusted you to get us out of there alive. Because I'm an amazing pilot, Derek replied, his voice muffled from inside the deck plating. He yanked a burnt wire free with a loud grunt, holding it up triumphantly before frowning. Or incredibly lucky. Depends on your philosophy. Lucky would imply skill had something to do with it, Zara shot back. Harsh, Derek said, tossing the dead wire over his shoulder. He wiped his hands on his shirt and stood up, flashing her that same crooked grin. But fair. Suddenly, the ship jolted violently, throwing Derek off balance. A low, agonizing grinding noise echoed from the engine room beneath them. Zara's hand instinctively dropped to her dagger. That didn't sound like luck, she said, already moving toward the cockpit. Derek hurried right behind her. Could be luck. Just bad luck. The cockpit was bathed in a cold, low-power blue light as critical system warnings flashed across the main console. Derek slid into the pilot's chair, his confident demeanor instantly slipping into genuine concern as he tapped the diagnostics display. Engine 2 is completely overheating, he muttered. I thought I patched that macrofracture last week. You thought? Zara asked, her voice dripping with disbelief. Hey, this ship is held together by ingenuity and good intentions. Derek defended. And she's still flying, isn't she? Define flying, she countered. Before Derek could reply, a completely new alarm blared. High-pitched, frantic, and insistent. Zara's hand tightened on the back of his chair. What now? Derek's face hardened as he checked the long-range sensors. Incoming ship. Small, incredibly fast, running completely silent with no transponder signal. Bounty hunters, Zara said instantly. Whoever tagged us with that tracker back at the station wasn't working alone. She leaned closer to the viewport, her sharp eyes scanning the starfield. Can we outrun them? Not like this, Derek admitted, pointing to the red structural damage reports. But I've got an idea. I don't like the way you said that, human. You haven't even heard it yet, Derek said, standing up abruptly and pointing toward the rear cargo bay. You're good with weapons, right? She tilted her head. Obviously. Perfect. We're going to need them. The storage bay was a chaotic mess of crates and outdated salvage. Derek shoved aside a heavy stack of broken plating, revealing a hidden compartment built directly into the floor. He pried it open with a grunt, revealing a hidden arsenal of black market weaponry. Zara knelt beside the cache, her sharp gaze instantly evaluating the gear. She picked up a compact plasma rifle, testing its weight and balance. Where did a simple smuggler get military-grade hardware like this? Derek shrugged, looking away. Here and there. Some traded, some found. Her gaze lingered on him, recognizing the deflecting tone, but she didn't press. She selected a lightweight energy rifle and tucked several heavy power cells into her belt. Are you certain this plan of yours will work? Nope, Derek said, pulling a small, cylindrical device from the bottom of the crate and holding it up with a grin. But it's going to be fun. Your definition of fun is going to get us killed. Maybe, he said, tossing her the cylinder. She caught it effortlessly. A disruptor charge? Tuned to what frequency? Specifically tuned to fry automated targeting systems, he explained, already running back to the cockpit. If we're lucky, it'll give us enough time to lose them in the uncharted sectors. The pursuing ship dropped out of hyperspace just minutes later. It was a beautiful, terrifying interceptor painted in dark gray armor plating. Its weapon pods were already extending, locking onto the rust bucket's exhaust trail. Here they come, Derek said, his voice dropping all humor. Zara slid into the gunner's seat, her fingers steady on the triggers. Keep the ship steady. No promises, Derek replied, slamming the flight stick forward and sending the freighter into a steep, stomach-churning dive. The interceptor followed flawlessly, unleashing a continuous stream of plasma fire that bubbled the space around them. Zara fired back, her shots incredibly precise, but the enemy's heavy shields absorbed the impacts without buckling. "We aren't going to win a conventional firefight," Derek shouted. "Then stop wasting time and get me in position," Zara snapped. "Working on it." He threw the ship into a punishing, G-force-heavy turn, pulling the rattling freighter directly alongside the enemy craft's lateral flank. "Now, Zara." Zara pulled the manual release, hurling the disruptor charge out of the auxiliary port. It tumbled through the vacuum before magnetically anchoring itself directly to the interceptor's command bridge. A microsecond later, it detonated in a brilliant pulse of blinding blue ionic energy. The enemy ship's automated targeting arrays instantly flickered, sparked, and went completely dark. "Direct hit," Zara said, a rare note of pure satisfaction in her voice. "See? Told you." Derek laughed, punching the remaining thrusters. The disabled interceptor struggled to recover, its weapons firing blindly into the empty void as the rust bucket surged away. But the victory was short-lived. The stars outside suddenly began to twist, warp, and bend unnaturally around a massive, faintly glowing distortion in the fabric of space. The ship began to shudder violently, the engines screaming as an invisible, immense gravitational pull locked onto their hull. "What is that?" Zara demanded, gripping the back of Derek's chair. Derek's face drained of color as he stared at the primary sensor readouts. "A localized gravity spike. A rogue spatial anomaly. And we just flew right into its event horizon." Act 9, The Edge of the Void. The gravitational shear tore at the hull, metal groaning against metal as every console in the cockpit flared a violent, blinding red. Alarms screamed a deafening chorus of impending doom. Zara braced herself, convinced this was the end, but when she looked at Derek, she didn't see terror. He was laughing. It was a wild, manic, completely unhinged human laugh that made Zara wonder, not for the first time, if his species simply lacked a basic survival instinct. His hands blurred across the manual overrides, wrestling with the flight stick like a man taming a wild beast. "Come on, sweetheart," Derek shouted over the roar of the dying engines, talking directly to the ship. "Don't break on me now." With a final, agonizing shudder that felt like it would rip the rust bucket into individual bolts, the ship caught the gravitational wave. The anomaly's immense pull translated into raw, terrifying velocity. The rust bucket shot out of the vortex like a kinetic slug from a railgun, propelled into the deep, empty quiet of safe space. The alarms suddenly cut out, replaced by the low, exhausted wheeze of cooling thrusters. Zara slowly released her grip on the pilot's chair. Her knuckles were stark white, her predatory breath ragged. She looked out the viewport. The anomaly was shrinking rapidly behind them. They were alive. Derek slumped back in his seat, wiping a fresh layer of sweat and engine grease from his forehead. He let out a long, shaky breath, turned his head toward her, and flashed that same, ridiculous, boyish grin. "See," he gasped, his voice cracking slightly. "Perfect execution." "You are completely, utterly insane," Zara whispered, her black eyes wide with genuine shock. "We should have been crushed into atomic dust." "Hey, a win's a win," Derek said, weakly throwing his hands in the air. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I think my soul is still back there in that gravity well. I need a minute." Act X, The Human Element. Hours later, the rust bucket drifted safely in a completely uncharted sector of space. The damage was extensive, but as Derek had proudly pointed out, the life support was still humming, and the coffee dispenser, miraculously, was operational. Zara sat alone in the common area, staring down at her cup of engine coolant. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel the urge to look over her shoulder. She didn't feel the phantom weight of a bounty hunter's crosshairs on her back. She looked up as Derek walked in, carrying a heavy wrench and looking entirely exhausted. He dropped into the seat across from her, groaning as his muscles relaxed. "Well, the hyperdrive is patched," Derek said, rubbing his eyes. "It'll get us to a quiet moon I know in the outer rim. No syndicates, No bounty boards. You can disappear there. Start over. Zara studied him. The galaxy feared her. Entire empires had put a price on her head because of her lethal efficiency. Yet, this fragile, lanky human had risked his ship, his life, and his sanity to protect her, for absolutely nothing in return. Why? Zara asked quietly. Derek blinked, caught off guard. Why what? Why risk everything for me? She pressed, leaning forward. You knew the danger the moment you saw my face on that board. You aren't stupid, Derek. You knew what coming with me meant. Humans are supposed to be fragile, yet you threw yourself into the jaws of the galaxy's worst monsters just to keep a stranger breathing. Derek's smile softened. He looked down at his calloused, grease-stained hands, then back up at her. The galaxy is a cold place, Zara, he said softly, the playful cadence gone from his voice, replaced by something deeply earnest. Out here, everyone's looking for a reason to exploit someone else. But humans, we're weird. When we see someone backed into a corner, running for their life, we don't see a bounty. We see ourselves. We see someone who deserves a fighting chance. He stood up, tossing the wrench onto the metal table with a dull clatter. Besides, he added, the boyish smirk returning to his face. The galaxy thinks it's so tough. It's fun to throw a wrench in its gears every once in a while. Get some rest, assassin. We reached the drop-off point by morning. Act 11, a new crew. As Derek turned to walk back to the cockpit, Zara looked down at her cup. She took a sip. It was bitter, hot, and tasted faintly of copper and smoke. An acquired taste. Derek, she called out. The human paused at the threshold, looking back over his shoulder. Yeah. Zara stood up, strapping her dagger firmly back onto her thigh. She walked over to the clutter of tools, picked up a plasma welder, and looked him dead in the eye. Your secondary coolant line has a microfracture, and your targeting calibration is off by 3 degrees, she said, her voice steady and commanding. You're a terrible mechanic, human. Derek blinked, then let out a soft chuckle. I told you, she's got character. She has structural failure, Zara corrected, walking past him toward the engine room. Show me how to fix the hyperdrive. If I am going to stay on this floating piece of scrap, I refuse to die because of a loose wire. Derek froze, his eyes widening slightly as her words registered. Wait, stay? You're not taking the drop-off. Zara paused, looking back at him. For the first time since she had sprinted out of the dark alleys of ROK Station, the coldness in her black eyes was replaced by something else. A spark of life. A sense of purpose. The galaxy is looking for Zara en Rule, the lone assassin, she said, a faint, predatory smirk finally breaking across her green face. They won't be looking for a co-pilot on a rusted freighter run by a lunatic. Derek stared at her for a second, completely stunned, before breaking into the widest, most triumphant grin she had ever seen. Well then, Derek said, stepping aside to let her lead the way. Welcome to the crew, Zara. Let's go break some rules. As the rust bucket vanished into the stars, the galaxy remained vast, cold, and dangerous. But for the first time in a very long time, the deadliest assassin alive wasn't running anymore. She had found a human. And humanity never lets its own go down without a fight. The dark, sleek interceptor of the Thalari High Command drifted silently in the shadow of a dying star. Inside its sterile, hyper-advanced bridge, Commander Valen stared at a holographic tactical display. The primary tracking beacon for Target 001, Zara en Rule, had completely vanished near a dangerous sector of rogue gravity anomalies. A lower-ranking officer stepped forward, bowing tightly. Commander, the tracking telemetry has been completely purged by an unknown high-frequency ionic burst. Sensors indicate a localized gravity spike occurred at those exact coordinates. There is no trace of her vessel. The target is presumed destroyed. Valen's deep black eyes narrowed as he studied the residual energy readings. There was something wrong with the telemetry. It wasn't the clean, mathematically perfect evasion path of a trained Thalari operative. It was chaotic, erratic, unpredictable. Scan the debris fields, Valen ordered, his voice cold and flat. Zara does not die easily. Sir, our long-range scanners did pick up a faint transponder signature escaping the gravity just before the blackout. The technician hesitated, checking his datapad. But the registry belongs to a low-tier, class, 4 Terran freighter. A junk ship. No military capability. It is impossible for a vessel of that class to survive a Class 5 event horizon. A Terran ship, Valen murmured, the name of the species tasting bitter on his tongue. Humans. They were a young, fragile species by galactic standards. They lacked the natural armor of the Crovath, the razor-sharp predatory instincts of the Thalari, and the hyper-advanced psionic capabilities of the Ascendancy. Yet, whenever the galaxy drew a neat, logical line, humans had a maddening habit of erasing it entirely. They flew ships that should have been scrap metal, survived wounds that should have been fatal, and actively threw themselves into deadly conflicts out of a bizarre concept they called spite. Double the patrol sectors in the Outer Rim, Valen said, turning away from the viewscreen. If Zara N. Rule is dead, the galaxy is a safer place. But if she is on a human vessel, then she is no longer playing by our rules. Outro animation and audio cues. Production note. Outro and screen layout. Bring up the high-energy, classic HFY synthwave soundtrack. Fade the background down to a stylized space graphic. Position the channel subscribe button in the center left, with 2 rectangular video recommendation boxes on the right. Narrator voice. Zara N. Rule spent her entire life running from the galaxy's monsters, only to find shelter in the one place the syndicates never dared to look, the passenger seat of a mad human's rusted freighter. Because when the rest of the galaxy sees a bounty, humanity only sees a reason to break the rules. If you enjoyed this journey into the Rust Bucket, make sure to smash that like button and subscribe to the channel for more daily HFY stories that prove why humans are the most beautifully unpredictable species in the cosmos. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. How long until Zara completely redesigns Derek's ship into a flying war machine? Check out the videos on your screen right now to dive straight into another thrilling tale of humanity, showing the galaxy what they're truly made of. Until next time, spacefarers, keep throwing wrenches in the gears.